Hey everybody, and welcome to Mr. Hart's reading the last chapter of OK for Now. Folks, when we last left our hero Doug, he had just finished being the character of Helen Burns in the play Jane Eyre. And at the end of the end of the chapter, we had a little bit of a cliffhanger because Lil had left early in the play because she was complaining of stomach problems, and her parents were going to take her to the hospital. At the end of the chapter, though, when Doug is reunited with his brothers at home, he finds out that it wasn't just a mere stomach ache that Lil was having. And from the looks on their faces, something much, much worse seems to be happening here. So we are going to see right now what is the fate of Lil, what exactly happened to her. And we're going to read just our last chapter to see what happens with all of our characters. Chapter 10, The Arctic Turn. Here is the stat that the doctors gave Mr. and Mrs. Spicer. 1 in 4. And that's the last stat I'm going to give you. Because so what? So what? Stats don't mean anything. Every time Joe Pepitone steps to the plate, it's new. And it doesn't matter if he's hit 500 home runs or if he's struck out 500 times. It's a new thing. And no one can predict what's going to happen except that he's Joe Pepitone and he's going to try his darndest. And he's not going to let anything get him down. And he's going to fight his way through no matter what. And he's got all the friends behind him. And if you don't think that matters a whole lot, then you don't know how to get from first base to second. Because you know what? Stats don't mean anything. On the first Saturday of June, I got to Spicer's Deli early since I figured Mr. Spicer would need my help since Lil wouldn't be there to load the wagons anymore. And I was right. When I got there, the first wagon wasn't even close to being loaded. Mr. Spicer was standing on the back, one hand holding the orders, the other messing up his hair. I can do that, I said. Yeah, Lil usually does it, Mr. Spicer said. I know, I said. I took the list from his hand. Doug, I'm going to have to let you go with all the hospital bills. You can't believe what they're going to be. I just don't have enough to pay you anymore. Well, you know what? I don't have anything else to do on Saturday mornings anyway, so you don't have to pay me, I said. I know. What a chump I am. But Mr. Spicer, he looked at me for a long time, and then he nodded, his hand back to the air, and he went out front. I loaded the first wagon. At Mrs. Mason's house, she handed me an envelope with money for groceries, and then she gave me another $20. This money is for the little girl, she said. Mr. Loeffler was waiting for me with a glass jar of yellow tulips. Will you see that little girl soon? When you do, would you mind giving her these? And he handed me the tulips. And all the Doherty kids were waiting for me when I got to the house, sitting on their front stoop. They were all holding pictures they had drawn. They drew a picture of Lil getting better. And Bill, she was jumping over a fence. And in Polly, she was riding her bike with that stupid basket in front of the library. And in Jules, she was flying over Washington Irving Junior High School. And in Davy, she was reading a huge stack of books under a tree. And in Franzi, she was kissing someone. Who's she kissing, I asked. And at that moment, they all started to giggle. It was me. I was almost a chump there. And at that moment, I almost began bawling in front of all the kids. But at Mrs. Windermere's, she was waiting too. She opened that door into the kitchen, and we put the groceries away, and I asked how the play was going, and she said it was going fabulous. And I asked how the girl Mr. Gregory got to replace Lil was, and she said fine, but she wasn't nearly as good as Lil. And I asked about the shrieking, which I wasn't doing anymore since I was going down to New York City. If I was going to go down, it was not going to be for a play. It was going to be to see Lil. And Mrs. Windermere said someone else was doing it now, but she wasn't sure who. And then she asked about Lil. And at that moment, I was a chump. I cried a lot. When I got back to that deli, Mr. Spicy was bawling besides the cash register, just bawling, and not even trying to hide behind the flowers that were lined up in the pots in the corner. All orchids. We were both chumps at that moment. But you know what? It's not so bad when you're a chump together. It's not so bad when you're crying with someone else. At the library, Mr. Powell spread out my sketches of the Arctic Turn on the table, one of the big sketches as big of Audubon's. I thought we might try to work with some watercolors today. Perhaps we could start with the background. A box on a table held maybe 15, 16 circles of paint and a bottle of water. Mr. Powell, I said, we'll mix the colors until we get them right. Mr. Powell, We don't have the Arctic Tern plate anymore. How will we even know? Well, we have what we remember, he said. I sat down and I looked across the room to the table where Lil usually was sitting. It's going to be a surprise for her, said Mr. Powell. He dipped a brush in the bottle. Let's get the colors of the water first. He swirled the brush into the blues, then handed it to me. What do you think, he said. It looks like the color of New Zealand, I said. Let's see what happens when we start mixing them together, a little bit at a time. And so I tried mixing them together a little bit at a time. And here's what happened. The right color came. We both saw it at the exact moment. Exactly the right color of the cold, smooth, frothy, deep water below the Arctic Tern. Not at all like New Zealand. Now draw your brush evenly along the line. Right. Keep on. Now let the brush up from the paper. Right. Dip your brush again and start back to the top. Draw down. Oh, no, it's all right. Let the paint suggest the texture. Down, and again. That afternoon, I painted in two the ways behind the Arctic Tern. How many times did you mess up? Asked Lil. None. Doug, you are such a liar. You'll see it when you get back home. And then we were quiet because we didn't know exactly when that would ever be. But I'm not lying. You wouldn't want to be there where Lil was for very long. If you took the blue paint of the waves and added some green to make it look more like puke, that would be the colors of her walls. And the tiles on the floor and the curtains of the window and the tube that led to a dripping bag and to a needle that got stuck in Lil's arm somewhere underneath the tape. Does it hurt? I said. Well, how do you think a needle stuck in your arm would feel? She said. I think I'd start shrieking like an insane woman who'd been locked in an attic for a great many years, I said. That's what it feels like, she said. Do you want me to shriek for you right now? I said. She thought about that. Well, that might help. You really do shriek pretty good. But then they might kick you out, and I don't want that. So I didn't shriek. She held out her hand, and I took it. I love playing Sarah Helen Burns. I just don't want to be Helen Burns. You can sit down on the bed, you know. It's not going to break, at least not because of a skinny thug like you. I thought, I'm not going to break either. 1 in 4, and I will be the one. I sat down on her bed. When this is all over, we're going to go to Broadway and we're going to see Jane Eyre. And then we're going to go to the top of the Empire State Building. And after that, we're going to see dinosaurs at the Museum of Natural History. And then we're going to walk on the 5th Avenue like we own it. A nurse came in. It's time to draw some blood, honey. Just a little poke. And afterwards, we're going to go to Central Park, and you're going to sketch people and charge them $5 a drawing. And then we're going to take that money, and we're going to find a French... Ow! She squeezed her eyes shut when she got pinched. A French restaurant, and we're going to eat stuff that we can't even pronounce. Just a few more minutes, the nurse said to me. She's tired. So just a few more minutes, then you have to go, okay? Lil opened her eyes. Someday I'm going to live in New York City, she said. Really? I'm pretty happy in Marysville, I said. Lil opened her eyes really wide. And maybe I did the exact same thing because it kind of surprised me too. But honestly, it was true. It really was. I was happy in Marysville. I didn't even know it until I said it. But it was true. We'll have to find a compromise. No, we won't. We're going to live in Marysville, I said. Her eyes started to close. You're such a jerk. It's cold in this room. You can lie down if you want and get under the blankets with me. So that's what I did. She had to scoot over a little, and it wasn't easy because she was attached to me so much. And we had to move the tube going in her arm so that I wouldn't lie down on it. And that wasn't so easy either. And then but we hurried because we knew we had only a few minutes before the nurse came back. And I laid down next to Lil and I put my arm around her and I felt her relax into me. And when she spoke, it was only in a whisper. Doug, she said, I sure hope I'm the 1 in 4. You are, I said. Who says? Me, I said. And then there was a long silence. I thought she was almost asleep. And then she said, all right. And that's when I knew. And I mean I knew. I really knew that she was going to be all right. Don't ask me how, but I knew. I'm not lying. Not about this. Not ever about this. You see, stats don't mean anything. But some things do mean everything. And that June, those things that mean everything, they kept coming faster and faster. On the second Saturday after my deliveries, Lucas was waiting for me in front of Marysville Free Public Library. I could tell he'd been out looking for work all morning. He had that tired, beat-up look, and it wasn't very hard to figure out what he'd be hearing. I'm sorry, son. Nothing for you today. I don't think you can handle it. Don't waste my time. You'd look tired and beat up too if that were you. If you'd been hearing that. So you want me to pull you up the steps? I said. And he looked at me. His face got hard for a second. You know, like the old Lucas. But not exactly like the old Lucas. You don't think I could do it myself? Lucas? You don't think I can handle it? I think you can handle anything, I said. Darn right. Darn right I can handle anything. So he turned around and backed his wheelchair towards the 6 steps. Then he looked over his shoulder, leaned back, and pulled up in front of the left wheel. Then he leaned back even more, and I'm not lying, that wheelchair started to go up the first step, kind of crooked, but up. And then he began to fall over, and I started towards him. But he leaned forward and he caught himself. And he had the left wheel up on that first step, and then he leaned again and pulled up on the right wheel with a heft there. He was, and the second step balanced, and he looked at me sweating. What do you have that goofy grin on your face for? He said. All right, do it again, I said. And he backed up the next step, leaned back, hifted up, and he sweated. Not bad, I said. Then he did the third step, and he almost went that time too, but he caught himself, and he leaned forward a little bit more, and then the fourth, the fifth, and then he drew himself back for the sixth, and grunted and pulled and came back down. On to the fifth. No, stay put, little brother. I did, and you would have too. He backed up, waited for a moment, leaned against the left and pulled up, squeezing his eyes tight and brought that chair half up, then leaned to the right, squeezed his eyes again, and so came the last step of the Marysville Free Public Library. He was breathing again heavily. So was I. Not bad, I said. It's all in the balance, Lucas said. Yeah, but you were a little slow. I guess I'll have to keep practicing. Then that smile came. Then the library door opened, and out came, and you're not going to believe this, but because it was June, and as true, out came Coach Reed from the library. I'm not lying. Pretty good, he said to Lucas. Thanks. It would take a lot of strength to pull yourself up like that. I guess, said Lucas. I guess, said Coach Reed, and he looked at me. Is this your brother? I nodded. Jack Reed, he said to Lucas, and he held the door to the library open so that Lucas could wheel himself through. Lucas probably didn't want him to, but after a day of trying to fit your wheelchair through the doors of that place that didn't want you to, he might have been glad to have someone hold the door open. I looked at Coach Reed as I went in, and he looked back at me. I went on in, over to the elevator. Hey! Coach Reed said. Lucas stopped and slowly spun himself around, and you know what? He looked like he was going to be okay. He might be tired and beat up, but he was going to be okay. That's what he looked like. And it was June, and I bet those archer terms fly strong in June. I heard you're trying to look for a job, said Coach Reed. Yeah, that's right, old Lucas' voice. Any luck? Yeah, I got lots of them. Everyone around here says that a guy in a wheelchair is just the guy they have been looking for. I'm trying to decide between many jobs at the moment. I don't know. I've got about 8 or 9 offers, though. Ooh, that sounds tough. Lucas started to spin around again. Maybe you could come work for me, said Coach Reed. He really said that. How I love June. But Lucas didn't believe him. That's funny, real funny. You ought to be on stage. You can make a living telling guys with missing leg jokes. They're not as funny as guys with missing arm jokes, but maybe you could come up with some of those too. No, I'm not kidding. Lucas wheeled himself closer. Still the old Lucas. So what do you want me to do? Coach track? Maybe the high jump on the pole vault? I'm a heck of a pole vaulter. Coach Reed looked at me, then back at my brother. Maybe track, maybe gymnastics. I saw you come up the stairs, maybe even weight training. I've got a feeling you might be able to do a whole lot of things you don't think you can do. How do you know? Because I was there too, in Vietnam. Then there was a long silence. I need an assistant, said Coach Reed. Then maybe you better find someone who... No, I need an assistant high school gym coach. There are 2 weeks left of the school year. If you started now, you could get your feet wet and be ready for September. If you haven't noticed, I don't have any... No, none of that. Monday morning, 7 o'clock in the morning, we're beginning the last basketball unit. If you're there, the job is yours. That is, if you think you can keep a bunch of junior high school kids from pulling any funny business on you. I won't be there, said Lucas. Coach Reed looked at me. Yes, sir, Buster, he will be there, I told him. All right, then, I'll see you there. I think I could have kissed Coach Reed at that moment. Lucas looked at me. I'm not going to take a job I can't do. You're right. You know what, Lucas? I don't think you can handle it. And at that moment, Lucas stared at me like the old Lucas was going to say something. But the old Lucas didn't. Instead, Lucas nodded. His face got all set and determined. And then he started to smile. And he spun his chair around. Miss Marion walked up. She had glasses on, and she didn't look so loopy. Lucas laughed, and he laughed. Can I help you? She said to him. I think I'm fine, I said. He said. Then we took the elevator upstairs. Lucas didn't mind the steel gate that we had to draw over across. And then he also didn't mind that the elevator rattled around all its way up. And he didn't mind the sound of the pulleys straining themselves, and he didn't mind that at the top the elevator stopped a couple of inches below the floor. He jerked his chair up and pulled himself over the lip. And at the table where Lil usually worked, Mr. Powell was mixing watercolors. You're late, he said. Yeah, Lucas just got a job offer, I said. For what position? Assistant junior high gym coach, said Lucas. We start basketball unit on Monday. And you know what? I'm not lying. Mr. Powell didn't even seem surprised at all. Well, you got to make him do free throws. Free throws discipline the mind and eyes and the hand. There's nothing quite like them. Lucas laughed. So good. It sounds like you know what you're talking about. Mr. Powell raised an eyebrow. I'm a librarian. I always know what I'm talking about. Mr. Swiatek, does this gray look right? He went over to the table, which you might remember my Arctic Tern was on the top of. Who drew this? Lucas asked. He didn't need to lean down so close anymore. Your brother, said Mr. Powell. And Lucas touched the edge of the paper. It's a copy, I said. My brother? It looks like he's flying off the page. He's falling into water, I said. Lucas shook his head. No, he's not. He's going wherever he wants to go. That's exactly right, said Mr. Powell, and he handed me a paintbrush. Do you know what it feels like to show color onto an Arctic Tern flying off the page? An Arctic Tern that's going to go wherever it wants to go in life? Terrific. It was June, you remember, and on Monday, Lucas left the house before I did. Heading to Washington Junior High School. I went to the gym between periods to watch him practice free throws from his chair. The stats weren't so good, but if you remember, stats don't mean anything anymore. During lunch, which I had again, I watched Lucas run basketball drills, and at the end of the day, he was gathering up loose basketballs when I came in, and James Russell was calling out, Coach Swiatek! You think Lucas wasn't smiling when he heard that? You think I wasn't smiling when I heard that? I waved, and Lucas waved back, and I went into Coach Reed's office. Sorry, guys. He had the presidential physical fitness chart spread out, and he was going through each one with his finger on the line. He paused and looked up at me. Thanks, I said. Go home, Doug, he said. June. Gotta love it. Somehow the message had gone out to all the teachers that the last 2 weeks of school would be the opportunity to bury students of Washington Junior High School with homework. Every other school in the country was getting ready for campouts and parties to celebrate the end of the year. But not us. See, in world history, Mr. McElroy started the causes of World War I. Do you know how many causes there were in World War I? No wonder they fought. And in English, Miss Calber said that we are going to be finishing a year with selection from John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie, which didn't sound bad because Charlie's a dog, and how bad could a dog story get? And honestly, it wasn't bad because, except we had to keep notes about Steinbeck's technique because we were about to be writing our own travel accounts, fictional or non-fictional, for this year's final composition. Doesn't that sound all fired exciting? In advanced algebra, Mrs. Verne told us that she was going to end the year with an introduction to geometry. And when we pointed out that geometry wasn't taught until 10th grade, she congratulated us on our powers of observation and told us to be sure to bring protractors the next day. In PE, we were practicing free throws every day, lots and lots of free throws, because they were supposed to discipline the mind and the eye and the hand, or so a wise man once said. But I didn't complain once to the coach. In phys science, Mr. Ferris announced NASA had given the go-ahead, and just in 1 month, Apollo 11 would blast off for the moon. He wouldn't stop smiling, because this is what happens when you dream dreams, he said. He wouldn't stop smiling even when he was describing the thermodynamics of the fuel of Saturn rocket that would carry the command capsules of the LEM. Otis Bottom asked if we were going to make some fuel to see if it would explode, and even then, Mr. Ferris couldn't stop smiling. In geography, we got all the way to France, and Mr. Barber started us on maps of France under Louis the 14th. Or maybe it was the 15th, I don't remember. And we were supposed to copy all the important rivers and mountains and cities and towns and underline the places that Louis XIV or 15 had visited across the geography, the story of the world. I'm not lying. The map that I drew was something that you could stop to look at. Audubon himself would have stopped and whistled, which is just what Mr. Ballard did. Then he crouched right next to me, and the scent of his coffee steamed up. "Douglas, did you trace that?" "Nope." "And are those seagulls?" "I thought they would add realism." "They're fantastic," Mr. Barber said. "Thanks," I said. And he whistled again, and then he stood up and he took a step. You know one thing that Mr. Powell taught me? He taught me that sometimes art can make you forget everything else all around you. That's what art can do. And I guess that's what happened to Mr. Barber, who forgot his left foot was behind his back leg of my chair, who took a step without remembering to take his foot away from my chair, and who tripped but caught himself, who couldn't catch, but at the same time he couldn't catch the coffee that flew out of his cup, that swirled around in the air for a second and finally splashed down all over my geography, the story of the world book. And right away it started to soak into all the pages just as fast as it could. I'm not going to tell you the sound that Mr. Barber made when he destroyed the very book that he told me to keep safe all year. It was something kind of like the shriek that an insane woman might make as she was locked in an attic for a great many years. My father hadn't said a word to me in weeks, or anyone really, ever since I saw Ernie Echo wearing Joe Pepitone's jacket. He wouldn't even look at me during supper anymore, which was fine, just fine by me. My mother covered the silence with talk about orchids, and Lucas couldn't stop talking about the job he had if someone had threatened to bloody murder him if he said another word. "They call me Coach Swiatek. Can you believe that, Coach Swiatek?" "Yeah, even if you can't shoot a three-throw worth diddly," said Christopher. 75% from the three-throw line now, Coach Swiatek said, which is a stat that he probably was stretching really far. I mean, really, really far. But trust me, my brother's not that good anymore. "That's something you dreamed of me," said Christopher. "Chris, why don't you open your mouth, look up to the ceiling, and we'll see how many of those carrots I can make into your mouth from here." "Lucas," said my brother, "it's all right. I'm not going to do it. He'll probably get them all in just out of spite. Isn't that right, Coach?" "Absolutely." My mother started laughing. Do you know how good it was to see my mother laugh again? My father left the table at that moment, but my mother, suddenly she stopped laughing. Lucas began eating his carrots, and Christopher held his fork still over the plate. "Isn't that orchid delicate in this light?" said my mother. Ah, how I love June. A week from Christopher's hearing, which was in the town of Marysville, was taking its time setting up, probably to make him sweat, my father stopped eating supper with us altogether. He'd fill a plate in the kitchen before he started, and then go to the bedroom. He didn't come out afterwards. But so what? So what? No one cared. Except maybe my mother. None of us talked about the hearing. None of us talked about what might happen. None of us used the word jail either. I mean, would you? Except at the hospital. At the hospital, I would talk about it. "You know that your debtor didn't break into the stores, right?" said Lil. And I nodded. "You're sure he didn't?" "I'm sure." Lil looked at me kind of slantwise. "Then he didn't do it, and everything's going to be okay. You don't have to worry." "Well, thank you, Judge Spicer." "You're very welcome. So get out of your funk before I throw my bedpan at your head." Classic Lil. But back at home, none of us talked about it. And meantime, I saw my father less and less. And when I did see him, he was sort of unstable. It's hard to say how exactly he looked like this. Maybe because of the way he stood, which with his hands in his pockets, his eyes looking anywhere but at you, and bent over like he was hurting. Until the day before the hearing, when he came home from work one night, he opened the door, and I was helping Lucas with his weights in the living room. And he came in. He was carrying Joe Pepitone's jacket. It looked as heavy as Lucas's weights, too. My mother came out from the kitchen, and my father handed me the jacket, Joe Pepitone's jacket, but his eyes were looking away from me the entire time. He went into his bedroom, and my mother followed. When they came out, they went to the kitchen. They put food on the table together, my father looking out of place, carrying a bowl of mashed potatoes. Then my mother sat down in her chair, and he sat down in his, and my mother didn't speak. Lucas started to talk to us about the new drill that he'd come up with for dribbling around cones, and then he'd go in for a layup. My mother and father and all of us filled our plates with mashed potatoes and green beans and pork chops. And Lucas and Christopher and me, we started to eat. But my father sat up in a full plate, and my mother sat with it in front of hers, and none of them ate. Not one bite. They didn't eat anything. And Lucas was still talking about dribbling, and my mother and father were looking at their full plates. That whole meal, they never said one word. Everything was quiet, except for Lucas, who just was talking up a storm about his new job. And then someone knocked on the door. My father looked at my mother, and my mother looked at my father. "Could you answer that, Chris?" said my mother. And when Christopher got up to answer the door, my mother stood and walked to the seat, sat down, and took my father's hand. Christopher came back, and behind him, Mr. Doherty was there, in uniform. "Good evening, folks. Sorry to bother you at dinner." He seemed huge in the house, or maybe it was his uniform that seemed huge. If he sat down on one of our kitchen chairs, he would have probably broken it into pieces, because he was that huge. "Hello," said my mother, and stood up. "Hello, Mr. Switek. The kids all say hello, Doug," Mr. Doherty said. "Yeah, tell him I said hi," I said. "I'll do that." He turned to Lucas. "I heard about the job, Coach." Can you guess what Lucas looked like when a huge Mr. Doherty called him Coach? Then Mr. Doherty looked at my father and nodded. "Mr. Switek?" My father nodded back, looking at my mother, never taking his eyes off my mother. Can you tell that not a single one of us knew what to say at this moment? "Would you like a pork chop?" my mom finally asked. Can you tell that my mother really did not know what to say to him at this moment either? "They look good, but I better not. I'm late for my own supper as it is, and you know what a missus will say if I can't take a bite of what she's been cooking." He cleared his throat twice. "Christopher," he said, the hearing is until tomorrow. You shouldn't be here." "There isn't going to be a hearing anymore," said Mr. Doherty. "There is no noise in space. Did you know that? If one of the Apollo 11 astronauts decides to go for a walk around a space capsule, he's not going to hear anything. There's no sound at all. Sort of like in our house for that next minute, there was also no sound at all." Then my father stood up. "Christopher," he said. Tried again. "Chris, we got an anonymous tip. We found all the stuff in the hardware store, everything, and the guy confessed to that and to breaking in at Spicer's Deli last fall." My mother got up and stood close to the father. "The Marysville Police Department would like to apologize to you, Christopher," said Mr. Doherty. "Chris," said my father, "the tip was anonymous, and as far as the investigating officer, who is me, is concerned, the case is closed. There's not going to be any more charges." My mother looked at my father's hand again. "And I'm very sure, that the person who phoned in the tip knows that getting involved with something like this could wreck a whole lot of people's lives, not only his." "I'm sure he does," said my mother. She went behind my father and put her arms around his chest, and my father reached up and held onto her hands. "And I'm sure he's got a terrific family, and he never meant to hurt them. I'm sure he knows now that they're all he really needs, and he doesn't need any dumb friends." "He does know that too," said my father. And Mr. Doherty nodded. "I'm sorry again, Christopher. If there's anything else I can help you do." "Thanks," said Christopher. "See you Saturday, Doug." "Yeah, I guess I'll see you then, sir." He turned, and he was gone. And you know what? The house was bigger at that moment. I'm not lying. It grew. It was like he left this hugeness behind him, and we had more room everywhere. And you know what else? It wasn't a dump anymore, it seemed. I don't know. Maybe I'm just a chump, but it suddenly seemed better. We all sat back down, and we all looked at our cold mashed potatoes and cold pork chops, and we were all real hungry. We started digging in like we hadn't eaten for a week. Christopher especially, and you could probably figure out why. Everyone was eating and laughing at how fast we were eating, and eating even faster. Mashed potatoes were flying. Lucas was belching, and Christopher was belching, and I was belching, and my father was belching. My father, who sat down in his chair where he was, no more food on the table, who looked around at us and said, "Isn't that orchid the most beautiful sight you ever saw?" I looked at my mother, and she had that smile, that June smile. And then my father looked over at my mother. I mean, the second most beautiful thing that I ever saw. That next morning, Principal Petey was waiting for me when I came to Washington Junior High School. He told me to come to my office after Mr. Barber's class. Mr. McElroy already knew I'd be late for world history. "And you'd better not try to get out of this," he said. He was smiling, though, when he said it. When I got to his office, I didn't have to wait for an hour like usual. His door was propped open, and he was standing beside it. He waited for me, and guess what was off the wall and leaning up against his desk? Just guess. But the first thing Principal Petey said was, "I'm sorry, I was wrong. I was wrong about a great many things, and I'm sorry." He held his hands, and I took it, and we shook. And then he pointed to Brown Pelican. "That's yours now," he said. And I nodded. "I always thought he sort of looked noble," I said. "That's the word I was thinking of, but now that you say it," he considered the Brown Pelican, "maybe so." Nah, he's definitely noble. "If you want, I'll drive it over to the library for you," he said. "Nah, I'm going to take it myself," I said. He nodded. He studied the Brown Pelican for a long moment more. "You know, Mr. Switek, I haven't told this to many students, but I'll tell you this. I think that you're going to go wherever you want to go in life." That pelican, as sturdy as if it was ever going to do to watch the world. "Thanks," I said. "Now you better go to Mr. McElroy's class. That bird will be waiting right there for you." I turned towards the door. "Mr. Switek," Principal Petey said, and I looked back. "Thank you for what you did for Coach Reed." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Principal Petey thanks you. Now go on." So I got on. Do you know what it feels like leaving that principal's office knowing that you're going to put a piece of something back and the principal just said thanks? Do you know what it feels like when the principal has just told you that you're going to go wherever you want to go in life? Do you know what it feels like when you think that you know just where you want to go and maybe you're already there? It feels like you're on Apollo 11 and the moon is in your sight. That's what it feels like. So I brought that Brown Pelican to the library after Saturday's delivery. I was a little late because Mrs. Mason had loaded me down with 3 hostess of 5 tall ferns. "For your mother's perennial gardens." When I told her she didn't have one, she said, "Well, she will, dearie, after this. It's June after all." Mr. Loeffler had the same idea. He loaded me down with 3 pots of sweet marjoram, which he said everyone needs in his or her garden. Mrs. Doherty figured that my mother would need a perennial garden. She dug up bridal wreath as tall as Ben and wrapped it up in a burlap. And Mrs. Windermere, she had heard too, I guess, because she gave me 5 yellow rose bushes. You know how long it takes to wheel all that stuff back to your house, though? Do you know how happy my mom was, though, to have it all? I'm not lying. She had the hostess, the ferns, the sweet marjorames planted before I got back from the bridal wreath. And the bridal wreath was planted before I got back with the roses. And so I was late to the library. But Mr. Powell didn't care. Somehow he knew about the Brown Pelican. He had Birds of America open to the right place, and we put it in together. "Just one more," Mr. Powell said. But I knew we'd never get that one. An anonymous collector from overseas grabbed it. I shook my head. "The book's always going to be missing one bird," I said. Mr. Powell shook his head. "Not exactly," he said. "What do you mean, not exactly?" I said. And that afternoon, I finished my Arctic tern, and he was beautiful. He was diving into the water because there was so much for him to find. The waves rolled all around him and were already starting to break, but he was going to be fine. He was going to do so much. He had so much to see. He was going to go wherever he wanted to go in life, and he wasn't alone, you know. If you could see the picture like I saw, there was a whole flock of Arctic terns all around him, all flying above those waves. And I'm not lying, they were a sight to see. And after I finished, Mr. Powell opened up the Birds of America book again. He laid my painting in a place where Audubon's turn was missing. Nothing is perfect, he said, but this one comes pretty close. On the last day of school, Mr. Barber collected the geography, story of the world books, and he paused for a moment when I handed him back mine. It was stained dark brown with the coffee, if you remember from earlier. It still smelled like his coffee, too, and I think at that moment Mr. Barber wanted to cry. On the last day in world history, Mr. McElroy asked us to pass in our final map, which we could make of any place we wanted to go in the world. But do you know where my map was of? Marysville. On the last day in English, we finished selections from Travel of the Charlie, and I turned in the travel log assignment. Do you know what I did my travel log assignment on? Let's just say it started with Cape Kennedy, and it headed up into the sky. And by the way, I just want you guys to know one more time that if I ever saw Percy B. Shelley, I still am going to punch him right in the face. On the last day of advanced algebra, Mrs. Verne told us that we made a great progress and that we were far in advance the most 8th grade mathematicians in the state of New York. And if we step up our studies, we will find all next year's algebra regiments exams to be well within our abilities, and we should fare quite well against the other algebra students in the great state of New York. Terrific. On the last day of physical science, we watched a film strip about Project Mercury space missions, a 6-man flights from 1961 to 1963, about the Project Gemini space mission after them, 10-man flights from 1965 to 1966. There was a ping before every frame, which was enough to make you wish we had never gone into space at all. But when it was finally over, Mr. Ferris turned on the lights and said, "Everything you have just seen is changing. With the flight of Apollo 11, scientific discovery is about to make a giant leap, and those leaps are going to come faster and faster. Someday, people are going to be buying these in antique stores." He held up his slides. "And they're going to have tiny computers that people are going to be carrying around with them, even in their pockets." Which I think he probably meant as a joke, because that sounds pretty ridiculous if you ask me. But on the last day of phys ed, Coach Swiatek made us run a mile, and he gave everyone one heck if they couldn't do it in under 7 minutes and 43 seconds. He told us that we better be running over the summer because we didn't fool around in high school PE. No siree, Buster. "How about you, Coach?" Otis Bottom hollered. Coach Swiatek wheeled around. "If you guys can't cross the line in under 6 minutes, you're not going to be able to touch me, that's for sure." "Is that a bet?" "Mr. Bottom, that is a bet." Now you know what Lucas is going to be doing all summer long. There was only one more thing that needed to happen in June to be perfect, and it did. For a little while, at least. That last week of the month, when everything was warm and green and there were hawks gliding on the high breezes, Lil came home for the first time. On that first Saturday back, we went to the library together, and I showed her the Arctic Tern and James Audubon's book, Birds of America. She looked at it, and she started to cry. I told you that what art can do to people. God, I love June. But Lil was only home for a couple of weeks, and then she had to go back to Middleton Community Hospital. I think she kept her eyes closed the whole way there. Mr. Spicer took me to see her the morning that Apollo 11 blasted off. You remember how Mr. Doherty seemed so big in our house? Do you remember that? Well, Lil's room filled with huge machines. They made her room seem very tiny. There are pictures of birds on the walls, not even close to good, though. There were 2 windows, but they were small and high up that you could only see for the sky. And you could only see the sky if you angled your head just right. There are more tubes and stuff dripping from the tubes right into Lil. Lil with her kerchief on when I came in, which she dressed down, dragging her tubes up with her arms, pressing down the kerchief so that I couldn't see that she had no hair. And she was crying. I turned the television on, and I laid down on her bed beside her, which took a lot of figuring out. And we watched Apollo 11 blast off to the moon. It was something. First, the flash of light leaps out everywhere, all the fire behind it. And then big clouds of smoke right behind the fire. And then slowly, like it barely moved at all, this huge tower of rock starts going up. And you can't believe it's really going up, but it is. And then it starts to tilt a little bit, and then its head up into the fire beneath it, and up and up and up, and suddenly it's hurtling towards the blue, flying faster than Audubon could ever imagine. And then it gets smaller and smaller, and you hear people on the mission control clapping and laughing, and you want to clap and laugh too, which Lil and I did. Together. It was beautiful, she said. And I looked at her. Beautiful, I said. We watched as the flicking light of the fire beneath the Saturn rocket, and I could tell about the thermodynamics of the fuel if you want to know. We watched the rocket move further and further up into the sky, heading to the moon. It was going to the moon! I held Lil's hand. It was trembling a little, her hand was. That needle was still in it. And when I looked at her, I could tell she was thinking of stats, even though they don't mean anything if you remember. You know, if I close my eyes, I could almost be that Arctic tern flying over the water. Then close them, I said. And she did. I want you to imagine a whole lot of Arctic terns flying around you, a whole lot. And she smiled. Now, imagine one coming down to fly right next to you to show you the next spectacular thing that's going to come in your life. Her smile got bigger. It's like landing on the moon, she said. Yeah, exactly, just like landing on the moon. Even her smile got even bigger. Her eyes were still closed. Will you stay next to me? She said. Always, I said. You think that moon's all there is? There's a whole lot more for us to see, too. Haven't you ever even heard of New Zealand? At that, she snuggled closer to me over the tubes. Always, she said. Always, I said. And I'm not lying. I heard all around us, over the sounds of the huge machines in the room, over the sounds of Apollo 11 heading to the moon. I heard all around us the beating of strong wings. And guys, that is the conclusion of OK for Now. I did have a couple things I wanted to leave you guys with, though. Okay. First off, I don't know. What do you guys think? What do you think the fate of Lil is going to be? Personally, I think she's going to survive. I know I have a habit of giving books where there's tragedy. Specifically, I guess we noticed this year where kids die. But even with that in mind, I still think Lil's going to make it. I think Doug is right. I don't think stats matter, and I think she's going to be the 1 in 4. I'm confident that Lil is going to survive. It appears she has some type of cancer, even though they never say the word cancer. Based on the tubes and all that stuff, it seems like she's getting chemo. So I would guess she's got cancer of some sort. I also, I don't know. I'm curious. I definitely can't wait to talk to you guys what your thoughts are over on the book. I like the book as a whole. I like the final chapter. I will say I like that so many characters get redeemed. The dad does not deserve to be redeemed, in my opinion. The father truly doesn't. He did way too many bad things. He was too much of a jerk the entire book. And even so what, he turned in his friend, from what the sounds of it. He turned in his friend, so suddenly that means he's a good guy. I don't buy it. I don't like that. His dad is a jerk, and the mom should have left him. That's how the book should have ended. I think I would have appreciated the book more if that happened. But anyway, guys, there's so much more to talk about. I can't wait till we have our next group hangout because there's a lot of things I want to bring up and talk about with you guys. Everybody, please have a great and wonderful Easter. And with that, I will talk to everybody soon. Bye-bye.